The Romans and the Jews famously did not get along very well with one another. This is something of an understatement. I mean, they really did not like each other. The Talmud famously describes the famed fourth beast from the prophecy of Daniel, which is referred to as dreadful and terrifying, which devoured, it crushed, and trampled, as referring to the Romans and their emperors. The famed Roman orator Cicero allegedly said that the Jews belong to a dark and repulsive force and are a nation of rascals and deceivers. So, clearly they did not get along. Seeing as both peoples were renowned for being ancient, highly religious, strong-headed, and prideful, with cultures and religions that clashed in nearly every conceivable way, it's really not much of a shock that things ended in the way that they did. Interestingly, the siege and subsequent destruction of Jerusalem is almost an irrelevancy in Roman history, which, being a history which literally spans continents and centuries, the brief Jewish revolt in the early 1st century and its subsequent repression is often worth barely a mention. Most would simply chalk it up as a brief but ugly siege culminating in the destruction and sacking of a city, which, if you know anything about Roman history, was nothing they hadn't done 100 times before. Where things change, however, is from the Jewish perspective. See, Jerusalem is a pretty important place in the Jewish religion, but even more so back in the days, due to them having their holy temple there. In fact, it was the Jews' second holy temple, the first one being destroyed by the Babylonians and their king, Nebuchadnezzar, in around 560 BCE, and after being in exile for several decades, they had finally rebuilt their temple anew, with Jews from all over the world making the pilgrimage several times a year to their temple, where the Levites, Kohanim, and the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would offer sacrifices to their god. So, hundreds of years later, when the Romans finally besieged and destroyed the Second Temple in 71 CE, it launched the Jews into an exile which they are still in to this very day. This incident basically defined Judaism and its practice for the next 2,000 years, and is possibly one of the most important post-biblical incidents in all of Jewish history. Now, a lot of people know the official story of the event, mostly dictated by Roman historians and the controversial Jewish historian Josephus. However, far less known, and in my opinion far more interesting, is the Talmud's account of the event. So to begin, you'll need to understand what the Talmud is. See, after the Babylonian exile and the destruction of the First Temple, most of the knowledge of Judaic law, which had been passed down to Moses and then from teacher to student for generations, began to fracture and be forgotten as the Jews were split across the country. After the Jews regathered in Israel and rebuilt their Second Temple, now with the Roman Empire as their neighbors, many different schools were formed, each with slightly varying teachings and opinions, and all in argument with one another. To resolve this, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, a scholar, philosopher, and, according to the Talmud, a close friend and confidant of the great emperor, Marcus Aurelius, compiled all the central opinions into a 6-book-long text called the Mishnah, detailing all the views on all the laws of the Torah. But the obvious issue still stood, which was all the differing opinions. So, after great effort and many years, the Talmud was compiled in the year 500 CE, around 430 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. It's about 40 books long and all written in ancient Aramaic, detailing thousands of pages of argument between all the greatest rabbis of the generation on every topic in the Mishnah, ranging from legal and monetary dispute, laws of Shabbos and kosher, court, prayer, holidays, and many more, arguing, proving, disproving, citing sources, and using the traditional 13 methods of biblical exegesis to figure which opinions exactly were correct. However, it was all said mostly verbally and written via stenographer, and the rabbis got sidetracked very often, and it was all recorded. So, the Talmud is filled with pages of ancient medical advice, explanation on biblical texts, personal anecdote, and a lot of history. And being that this was all written recently after the destruction of the Second Temple, in the middle of the tractate Gittin, the book dealing with the laws of divorce, all the rabbis spend a few pages to gather and discuss the history and accountings of that devastating event. It begins with a story. As a result of the incident involving Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, Jerusalem was destroyed. A certain man, who had a friend named Kamsa and an enemy named Bar Kamsa, made a banquet. He told his attendant to bring his friend Kamsa to the party, but the attendant mistakenly invited his enemy, Bar Kamsa, as their names were similar. Bar Kamsa attended the feast, and when the host saw his enemy there, he got angry and demanded his immediate eviction. Bar Kamsa begged to stay to avoid embarrassment, first offering to pay the value of what he had eaten, then for half the banquet, and finally the entire banquet, but the host refused. Eventually, the host grabbed Bar Kamsa and forcibly ejected him, and so Bar Kamsa left, humiliated and furious, but not just at the unnamed host, but also at the rabbis who were seated at the banquet and did not rebuke him. It is evident that what had occurred was acceptable to them. He traveled and met with the representative of the Caesar, telling him that the Jews had rebelled against him. The official asked for proof, and he proposed that the Romans send a delegation of a calf as a sacrifice to the Jews' holy temple. But along the road, Bar Kamsa caused a small blemish on the animal, making it unfit to offer as sacrifice. The rabbis considered offering it for the sake of peaceful relations with the Roman government, but in the end they decided against it, as it would set a bad precedent. One person suggested simply killing Bar Kamsa so that he would not be able to go and report the incident to the Roman government, but a rabbi named Reb Zachariah ben Avgulas protested against this idea. Much later, it was said, the tolerance displayed by Reb Zachariah ben Avgulas destroyed our temple, burned down our sanctuary, and exiled us from our land. In fact, there are actually 3 stories listed, the other 2 dealing with other political failings with the Romans, but the first one that's listed, the one regarding the man named Bar Kamsa and the banquet, is the most famous and the most quoted of the 3, and the reason why is because of what the story represents, religiously at least, as to why the Second Temple was destroyed for the Jews, and they were cast into a 2,000-year exile to this very day. At a glance, one might think it's because of the restraint shown in regard to the assassination planned on Bar Kamsa, but it's not. In Jewish belief, the reason why all this occurred was really the opposite. The Second Temple was destroyed because of strife and hatred amongst the Jews, and this story exemplifies that. See, it was a tumultuous time amongst the Jews in the Roman Empire. There was infighting amongst several religious factions, some of which, the Sadducees, crossed into outright blasphemy, and the tensions between the Jews and the Romans were at an all-time high. The high priest was an established puppet of the empire along with most of the Holy Temple. An attempt at a provisional government was made, which ended poorly. There was mistrust and misguidance, assimilation, hedonism, and heresies so great they were unforgivable, and so God decided his temple should be razed to the ground. The next story involves the Caesar Nero. Yes, that Nero, apparently, who sets out to attack Jerusalem. Interestingly, as an aside, whenever the Talmud writes the word Caesar, it actually spells it Kaiser, which is the original pronunciation used in those times. Just thought that was interesting. Anyways, as Nero approached, he shot an arrow towards the east, and it fell towards Jerusalem. He shot one towards the west, and it fell in Jerusalem. He continued to fire arrows, one in each direction, but they all turned and landed in the same spot. Finally, he stopped a young boy and asked him what verse he was learning. The boy responded, quoting Ezekiel, "I will take my revenge against Edom through my nation Israel." Edom, the descendants of Esau, refer to the Roman Empire. So, Nero, feeling that God would destroy whoever succeeded in taking Jerusalem, fled. He, referring to God, wants to wipe his hands clean on me. He ran away and converted to Judaism, and Rabbi Meir was descended from him. So, is this story true? There is quite a lot of exaggeration and allegory throughout the Talmud, and this could be an example of that. Some interpret that this was simply a general named Nero, and Caesar was a terminology used by the Jews to refer to any high-ranking Roman official. Some translate it differently, saying Nero sent a general who fled and converted. But what if it was actually the Nero? Historically, Nero died by suicide in 68 CE, 2 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, which was in around 70 to 71 CE. So the timeline somewhat adds up, and it's always possible that the Roman Empire would have falsified something as shameful as their emperor fleeing and converting to their enemy's religion. So it could have happened. Still, believe whatever suits you. The next Caesar mentioned is Vespasian, although unmentioned are the 3 Caesars in between, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, who attempted brief but violent coups one after the other, one of which included bribing the Praetorian Guard for an assassination, and the next a small but bloody civil war, all within a single year, known as the Year of the 4 Emperors. But in the end, Vespasian was appointed, and he ruled until he died. The other 3 emperors bore little relevancy to the Jews, so it's no wonder they weren't mentioned. Anyways, Vespasian set siege to Jerusalem for 3 years, although historically it was 5 months, which is where our story resumes. There were 3 wealthy men in Jerusalem, Nakdimon ben Gurion, ben Kalba Savua, and ben Sittisakeses. One said, "I will sustain the people," during the siege that is, with wheat and barley. One said, "with wine, oil, and salt," and the third, with wood. These 3 men had enough to sustain the people for 21 years. However, there were these Baryane, literally translating to empty men, among the people. These Baryane refer to the historical Zealots, a group of like-minded radicals who seized control during this period and insisted on a violent rebellion against the Romans, and would in the end doom them all. The rabbis had said, "Let us go out and make peace with the Romans." The Baryane would not let them. They said to the rabbis, "Let us go out and wage war against the Romans." The rabbis said, "It will not be successful." The Baryane, these zealots, arose and burned down the storehouses of wheat, barley, and wood, and there was a famine. All this lines up neatly with the histories written by Josephus, who is the main historic source for this event, although he adds that there was some cannibalism. The next story in the Talmud is particularly interesting. Abba Sikra, one of the leaders of the Baryanim, is contacted in secret by his uncle, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, a great sage and one of the leaders of the opposition to the zealots. He asked his nephew, "How long are you going to act in this way, and kill everyone through starvation?" Abba Sikra responded to him, "What can I do? If I say anything to the Baryane, they will kill me." Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, "Find me a way to get out of the city, and perhaps there will be a small measure of salvation." And so they devised a plan. The rabbi feigned illness for many days, and having planned with his close students, faked his passing. The students placed him in a coffin to be buried outside of Jerusalem, but the zealots guarded the gates. They demanded to stick spears through the casket to confirm the rabbi's death, but the students argued against them, stating, "Shall the Romans say that the Jews stabbed their rabbi?" Eventually, they were let through. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai reached the Roman camp, he said to Vespasian, who at this point was only a general, "Peace be upon you, O king." Confused, Vespasian demanded an explanation. The rabbi responded that he was destined to be a ruler, for if you were not destined to be a king, Jerusalem would not have been delivered into your hands. As they spoke further, a messenger arrived from Rome. He said, "Arise, for Caesar has died, and the dignitaries of Rome have appointed you as leader." Happily, Vespasian offered Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai a request, and he asked that he spare the city of Yavne and its sages, knowing that asking to spare all of Jerusalem would be too great of a request, and therefore refused. Once again, details of this line up with the historical accounting, particularly how Vespasian was appointed the new Caesar after the previous three's brief attempts to hold the position. In fact, the story is nearly identical to one told by Josephus, who says the entire thing, only with him getting captured and being the one meeting with the Emperor Vespasian. And finally, the destruction of Jerusalem. The general Titus, Vespasian's son, was sent, and he broke the siege. The Zealots, desperate, requested assistance from the Idumeans, who immediately betrayed them and attacked alongside the Romans. The Zealots were slaughtered, and then the common people. No man, woman, or child was safe. The streets flowed with blood and Jerusalem burned. Josephus estimates 1.1 million people were killed. Tacitus, the Roman historian, approximates 600,000, saying, "There were arms for all who could use them, and the number ready to fight was larger than could have been anticipated from the total population. Both men and women showed the same determination, and if they were to be forced to change their home, they feared life more than death." To this day, it is commemorated by a fast known as Tisha B'Av, a day of mourning and contemplation for all Jews. In the meanwhile, the Talmud states, "The evil Titus, who profaned and blasphemed God, what did he do? He seized a harlot in his hand and entered the chamber of the Holy of Holies, the most sacred part of the temple where the Ark of the Covenant was housed. He spread out a Torah scroll and lay with her on it. Then he took a sword and slashed the parechas, the curtain separating this area from the rest of the temple. A miracle occurred and blood was seen bubbling out. Titus thought that he had killed God." Yet again, the broader story fits with the history books. Titus besieged and destroyed Jerusalem, burning it and razing it to the ground. He destroyed the temple, leaving nothing but the western wall, which still stands to this day. The Arch of Titus commemorates all this, depicting the ransacking of the temple and its artifacts. Interestingly, the arch portrays the theft of the temple's menorah, the seven-pronged candelabra which was lit as part of the service in the temple, but it misrepresents it as the engraving shows it with curved branches, while in all Jewish historical accounts and laws dictating its construction, it's depicted as having 7 straight branches. Anyways, despite Titus's questionable actions, he's looked fairly well upon by history, having completed the construction of the Colosseum using funds stolen from the Jews, and handling the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii. He ruled in office for only 2 years, however, before succumbing to fever in 81 CE. The Talmud, however, relates a somewhat different version of events. After the Battle of Jerusalem, Titus returned home by ship. A hurricane at sea threatened to drown Titus. He said, "It seems to me that the power of the God of the Jews is only in the water." Pharaoh came and he drowned him in the waters of the Red Sea. Sisera came and he drowned him in the waters of Nachal Kishain. So too now he threatens to drown me in the waters. If he is truly powerful, let him come up on dry land and wage war against me there. A heavenly voice emanated and said to Titus, "O evil man, the son of an evil man, a descendant of the evil Esau, I have a puny creature in my world that is called a gnat. Go up on dry land and fight it." Titus ascended to dry land, and a gnat came and entered his nose. It picked at his brain for 7 years. When Titus eventually died years later in excruciating pain, they split his head open and found a gnat inside the size of a swallow. So, did Titus die of a fever, or by a gnat burrowing into and gorging itself on his brain for years? We'll probably never know. That's essentially the end of the Talmud's main narrative in regards to the fall of Jerusalem. It goes on for a few more pages, speaking about the Bar Kokhba revolt, the massacre at Beitar, and others. After all this, the remaining zealots fled to Masada and committed mass suicide, leaving only Josephus to report the tale. It speaks of the enslavement of the thousands of Jewish survivors, how they were turned into slaves or concubines or worse, how they were sold and degraded and scattered all over again, and how hundreds of them took their own lives rather than live through such sinful disgrace. One particular event is mentioned where a ship full of children threw themselves into the sea rather than become concubines to the Romans. Overall, it was a pretty tragic event in Jewish history, both from a historic lens and from a religious one. However, there is one last story. In a different tractate, this time Tractate Makos, at the very end, on the last page, it relates as follows. Decades later, 4 of the great sages returned to the ruins of Jerusalem. When they reached Mount Scopus, they tore their garments. When they reached the Temple Mount, they saw a fox emerging from the place where the Holy of Holies once stood. 3 of them started weeping, but the 4th, a man named Rabbi Akiva, laughed. When asked why, he responded that there are 2 prophecies in the Torah that are connected. One, the prophecy of Uriah, refers to the destruction of Jerusalem, but the other, the prophecy of Zechariah, refers to the eventual coming of the Messiah, the time of peace, prosperity, and holiness for the world, and the rebuilding of the 3rd temple. As long as Uriah's prophecy had not been fulfilled, I feared that Zechariah's may not be fulfilled either. But now that Uriah's prophecy has been fulfilled, it is certain that Zechariah's prophecy will be fulfilled. Meaning, now that the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed, it is certain that one day the prophecy of the coming of the Messiah and the resurrection of the dead which precedes it, 2 fundamental beliefs in Jewish faith, may one day occur. It said, initially, the 2nd temple was destroyed because of division, fighting, and hatred. But the 3rd and final temple will be rebuilt one day, once the world is filled with friendship, righteousness, and acts of goodness and kindness. With these words they replied to him, Akiva, Akiva, you have consoled us. So that's essentially all of it. Later, Rabbi Akiva would be captured and executed by the Romans, having his flesh flayed off and sold in the markets of Rome. The Jewish people would be scattered all over the world, the practice of the religion irrevocably changed, and would spend the next few thousand years being persecuted in and chased out of nearly every country in the known world. And yet still, despite this, in a testament to the resilience and fortitude, even until this very day the Jewish people persist, still here, outliving every other nation that has attempted to wipe them out, quietly living, praying to God, and trying to bring about better times.